There's a terrible war going on in the Caucasus, which started about a month ago. And we're not paying enough attention to it. And I understand why, because there's so many other things happening in the world during this year. But we really should. First of all, because what's happening is quickly escalating in a horrific war that doesn't seem to let up. But also because it tells us something about the direction in which we're headed and that region is headed. So in this episode, I just want to go over what's been happening, who's involved, why, and where this is all taking place.
The siren wails, and seconds later, the first of several cluster bomb strikes rips down the street. Each a collection of mini explosions, saturating the air with killer shrapnel. The people of Nagorno-Karabakh's capital, Stepanakert, have suffered multiple rocket and artillery attacks in recent weeks.
This round of fighting began when Azerbaijan attacked on September 27th an enclave within its territory which they do not control. This enclave is called Nagorno-Karabakh, or as the locals call it, Artsakh, and is inhabited by Armenians who've created kind of a breakaway state within the borders, the official borders of Azerbaijan, and which they've held for decades now. And what Azerbaijan has done is first launch drone strikes, missile strikes, and other airstrikes or helicopters, and then bring in armored equipment and artillery, try to capture some positions. And that has worked somewhat well, but apparently not as well as they would have liked, because since then the fighting has really escalated and expanded also into shelling of cities and using cluster bombs. And the Armenians have fought back. On both sides they are fairly well armed, and so this is really a conventional war where there have been already very many casualties. Putin said a couple of days ago that it's probably about 5,000 in total, and a lot of damage to cities, housing, and very many refugees have already fled the region. And it doesn't seem like this is letting up. There have been 2 attempts at a ceasefire, and in both cases these broke down almost immediately.
With talks between the two sides underway in Moscow, the Azerbaijani president tells Sky News that he's ready for a truce, but that he wants his lands back.
For us, it's a patriotic war. We are defending ourselves. We want to restore our territorial integrity to allow 1 million refugees to go back.
So the fighting seems to continue because Azerbaijan seems to think that they can solve this militarily and take the whole region, or enough of it to have a better negotiating position. But this is not the first chapter of this war. There had been clashes also this year earlier in July, and there's been a brief war in 2016 lasting 4 days. A very large war in the early 90s.
The two former Soviet republics have clashed periodically since the 1990s, when ethnic Armenians seized the Nagorno-Karabakh region, a conflict that claimed 30,000 lives.
And the warring parties have also fought each other in the tail end of the First World War and the Russian Civil War and the formation of the Soviet Union. And this is also not the only war in that area. In recent times there have been a number of wars actually there. There's been 2 conflict zones in neighboring Georgia, in the regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, not too long ago.
This was the scene early on August the 8th, 2008, as Georgian rockets pounded the breakaway region of South Ossetia. It was the opening of a devastating 5-day war between Russia and Georgia, with each side blaming the other for setting it off.
There have been also wars in Chechnya, just on the other side of the Caucasus.
In 1999, when the Russians laid siege to Grozny, Chechen rebels eventually found themselves surrounded. After months of holding on, they managed to break out into the mountains.
And if we look a bit further, then there's also the war in eastern Ukraine and over Crimea.
This machine gun nest overlooks the positions of the Russian military and their local separatist allies, who want to wrest control of eastern Ukraine from the central government in Kiev.
So this region is really developing into the most unstable flashpoint in the world right now. And it's worth trying to understand what's driving that and where this might be headed. The Caucasus is the mountain range that separates Eastern Europe, way Eastern Europe, from Western Asia. And if you consider it part of Europe, then it actually holds the highest mountains in Europe. The Mount Elbrus is the highest mountain. And because it's so mountainous, it is kind of a mountain redoubt for very many different ethnic groups and languages and religions. But on the other hand, it's also almost like a big isthmus running between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea that actually connects Western Asia and Europe. And that's why it's also been a region where different powers have always sought to expand their influence and control the area. And I think that feeds into all the wars that are happening there. The nature of the Caucasus as, on the one hand, a place of refuge or redoubt, but on the other hand, a thoroughfare, has really shaped the identities of the two warring sides in this conflict, but in really different ways. The Armenians consider themselves an ancient civilization which evolved out of states on the plain around Mount Ararat, where Noah's Ark famously made landfall according to the Bible. And so this dates back to the Iron Age. And there have been Armenian kingdoms and an empire that reaches all the way from the Levant to the Caspian Sea. And this is also one of the reasons why Armenians are spread out much more across the Middle East. There's Armenians in Lebanon, there's the Armenian quarter in Jerusalem, which is very ancient, because Armenia was the first state in late antiquity to adopt Christianity. They have their own form of Oriental Orthodoxy, the Armenian Apostolic Church. They have their own writing. And Armenians have been basically traveling around as pilgrims, but also as refugees all across the wider region for centuries. But over the course of history, Armenians have been forced to take refuge more and more into the Transcaucasus and in the mountainous areas there, and lost much of their land more in Anatolia, so that now Armenia is a relatively small state, but with an old culture that the Armenians are very proud of. Also in the context of this conflict, they point to, for example, very old monasteries and cathedrals also inside Nagorno-Karabakh, basically also as markers of their identity and ownership of the area. Azerbaijan, on the other hand, is a younger identity in a way. The name Azerbaijan refers to a satrapy of the Persian Empire, and most Azerbaijanis are Shia Muslim, although relationship with Iran are not that great. But they speak a Turkic language, which became more predominant in their area during the Middle Ages, when the August Turkic expansion took place, they used Latin writing, and that's basically very recently, because the current dictator, Aliyev, was the one who finally decreed that all Cyrillic writing should be phased out. And Azerbaijan is more low-lying. The capital, Baku, is at sea level of the Caspian Sea, and much of the hinterland is also very low-lying. The first time that there was an independent Azerbaijan as a state is only 100 years ago. And this is one thing that now comes up in the information warfare on social media, where Armenians mock Azerbaijanis for having a state that is younger than Coca-Cola. Not that that perhaps matters, but that's anyhow what they're being told. Now, how did that young statehood come about? Actually, when we look at the situation at the beginning of the short 20th century, so before the start of the First World War, then at that time everything in the Caucasus on the north side, also on the south side, is under Russian control, because Russia had been going through the same kind of development as the US, and where the US was expanding westward and industrializing and developing Coca-Cola, Russia was also expanding, and one direction in which they went was south, so into the Caucasus. And they had control over it, a little tenuous. There was always rebels and revolutionaries and bank robbers and all of the above. This is kind of how Stalin got started, as a career criminal and revolutionary in Tbilisi, in Georgia.
Stalin himself was in the underground. His task, to organize the fighting squads, the urban guerrillas of their day, planning bank raids, leading the life of a resistance worker, tough, resolute, brave, single-minded.
But it was all under Russian control, sort of. But then, when the First World War broke out, at some point, of course, Russia wasn't doing so hot, because the revolution broke out, and during the revolution, the soldiers on the front just left the trenches, and so the whole Russian front collapsed. So then all of a sudden there was a vacuum of power. And that vacuum of power was exploited to try to form different states. Now, the first attempt to form a state was an attempt which would have been very nice had it succeeded, because that was to have one big Transcaucasian federal republic that included Georgia and Armenia and Azerbaijan in one state. But that only lasted about a month, and then first the Georgians left, and then the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis both tapped out as well, both in 1918, and all declared their independence. And this independent Armenia was traumatized from the start. In the years prior, the Young Turks had committed the Armenian genocide, during which they marched very many Armenians living under the Ottoman Empire into the Syrian desert and murdered them or let them starve or die of thirst. By some estimate, this is about 1.5 million people. And survivors came as refugees into this new Armenia. And in some attempt to compensate for that, the victorious parties after the First World War decided to try to dismember the Ottoman Empire and give a larger chunk of land to Armenia in the Treaty of Sèvres. Now, that never happened because the Turks didn't take this lying down and fought their war of independence on many different fronts, because had this treaty gone through, Turkey would have been a tiny rump state but instead they took or recaptured or secured territory on all fronts on the edges of Anatolia, including parts of Armenia that were going to go to the new Armenian state, or would at least be cut off of Turkey. So this led to a war between this new Armenia and new Turkey. And when that war was all over, the remnants, the remaining parts of Armenia, were basically mopped up by the Red Army, because by then the Red Army was winning. So this is early 1920s, was winning the civil war also in the Caucasus, and one by one was mopping up the states that were attempting to form there. Georgia, Armenia, and finally also Azerbaijan. And in the case of independent Azerbaijan, that was because most of that army, the Azeri army, was tied up in fighting a rebellion in one of its areas that was more inhabited by Armenians, namely in Nagorno-Karabakh. So Azerbaijan came under Soviet control basically because of the same kind of fighting that's happening right now. What happened then was that the Soviet Union started incorporating these essentially conquered territories into different SSRs, right? Socialist Soviet republics, Georgian SSR, Armenian SSR, Azerbaijan SSR. And so they could draw borders however they wanted, and the person drawing those borders was the self-appointed expert on the question of the different nations, namely Stalin. He himself, being from the Caucasus, thought he understood how these people needed to be treated and where the lines needed to be drawn. And he was somewhat optimistic about the relationship between the Soviet Union and Turkey. So this is now the Turkey of Atatürk, so secular, no longer a caliphate, no longer Ottoman. And he thought, well, it might be a good idea to try to develop some kind of rapport and see if maybe down the line Turkey would also, as the next domino stone, fall and become part of the global communist revolution. And to kind of appeal to them, he decided to be more generous towards the Turkic people in the Caucasus. And so he decided to continue to keep this Nagorno-Karabakh region, which was majority Armenian, into Azerbaijan, because they might like that. But the global communist revolution never happened. Instead, the Second World War and the Cold War came, and by the time Stalin was finally dead, Turkey had become the keystone in the Western alliance against communism, and the resentments and unresolved conflicts in the Caucasus had been smothered under the Soviet blanket. Then, by the time that the Soviet Union was disintegrating, what was under that blanket? One of the things that the Soviet system had attempted was to push this whole idea of, the brotherhood of nations, and how nationalism is a bad thing, and how everybody was going to become model citizens of the Soviet Union. And so then, by the time that more narratives were allowed again under the openness policies of Gorbachev, many local politicians discovered that actually nationalistic politics did quite well, played quite well. This is kind of similar to the situation in former Yugoslavia, where all of a sudden this hyper-nationalism returned after Tito's death. And another thing that had been simmering under the blanket was, of course, these traumas from the time of the end of the First World War and the Russian Civil War, and essentially the conquest of the Caucasus by the Red Army, where massacres had taken place between Armenians and Azerbaijanis in both directions, and where the different nations each kind of felt that the incorporation in the Soviet Union had been to their detriment, losing Nagorno-Karabakh or being conquered by the Bolsheviks, to whom the Armenians were more sympathetic than the Azerbaijanis were. Also, there's cultural bias where the Azerbaijanis were seen as kind of culturally Turk adjacent, and so a threat with the memory of the Armenian genocide in the back of people's minds. And that all started bubbling back up in the late 80s. And once it became possible under Gorbachev for local politicians to propose changes and maybe to work towards independence, well, that became an opportunity for the people living in Nagorno-Karabakh to petition for independence or for joining Armenia. So during the time of the Soviet Union, Nagorno-Karabakh had been an oblast, which is basically like a county, more or less, or a province under the Russian system. And it had been kind of an independent oblast within Azerbaijan, and the people there, who were by the latest Soviet census were by far majority Armenian, wanted to join Armenia proper. And the leadership in what was then the Armenian SSR also thought this was a good idea and figured that this could probably work under the then prevailing ideas of, reform, and this could just be done democratically, and we could have a referendum and make it work. But the leadership of the Azerbaijan SSR was not interested in this at all. And on the contrary, as nationalistic politics bubbled up again, also a kind of Armenophobia came back again, and riots and pogroms started happening.
On January 13th, 1990, after 5 p.m., a crowd of some 50,000 people who were leaving from a demonstration at the Lenin Square, splitting into groups, committed pogroms, destruction, arson, violence, and murders. Izvestia newspaper, January 15th, 1990. A huge mob yelling the slogans, "Glory to the heroes of Sumgait, Viva Baku without Armenians," gathered at a meeting in Lenin Square. At nightfall, pogroms began. They were committed with inconceivable savageness and sadism. The area around the Armenian district became an arena of mass killings. People were thrown out of balconies of upper stories. The crowds were attacking the Armenians, beating them to death. Slogans to oust Armenians out of Baku were voiced during the demonstrations. Anti-Armenian slogans were heard from the crowd, and it was after this that the most horrible events happened.
And very quickly, this turned into a civil war between the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh and aided by Armenia proper and Azerbaijan. And in this civil war, the Armenians were at an advantage because within the Soviet system, they were slightly more equal than the Azeri and had more access to Russian weaponry, were aided by Russia. They secured almost the entirety of the Nagorno-Karabakh Oblast. There's a couple of tiny little wedges of land that they never quite captured. And also kind of a buffer zone that forms a corridor to connect the Oblast, which is otherwise completely enclosed by Azerbaijan, but now they could accomplish militarily that it was connected via a corridor to Armenia proper, which were areas that were inhabited by Azerbaijanis who were ethnically cleansed, and again massacres ensued.
It was a snowy night when Armenian soldiers attacked Matanat's hometown of Khojali. She fled with her family into the forest nearby, and it's there her husband and her 8-year-old daughter were shot dead. Matanat's sister-in-law also lost her husband. She was carrying her son on her back. He was shot as she tried to escape. Only the daughter she was pregnant with at the time survived. It's a nightmare this family relives every day.
By the time this war was over, there were very many Azeri refugees who had come from the areas that had been captured by the Armenians and who were now living elsewhere in Azerbaijan. And then that situation stabilized again in a kind of tenuous situation where there was going to be a peace process, which started in the mid-90s and never really went all that far, except that a group was formed, the Minsk group, which was the different powerful nations involved in trying to solve this.
Joining me in the studio, our international affairs editor Armen Georgian. Armen, France, Russia and the US jointly share the Minsk group. What is it and what can it do? How influential could it be in resolving this conflict?
Well, the OSCE Minsk group has been in existence since 1994. So ever since the end of the First Karabakh War, the co-chairs are Russia, France and the US. There are also several permanent members, including Turkey, and the two countries most closely involved in the conflict itself, that's to say Armenia and Azerbaijan. There's long been a perception in Turkey and Azerbaijan that the Minsk group is not effective, that it hasn't done enough to try and push the whole process forward. And officials in both of those countries have occasionally noted as well that France, the US, and Russia all have significant Armenian diasporas.
Now, meanwhile, other dynamics were also happening. Other things were also happening in the relationships between Russia and the West and the place of Turkey inside the West. Now, in the late 80s, Russia or the Soviet Union and the West were, the two equal superpowers, and there was this sort of statesman-like relationship between Gorbachev and Reagan, and they were equals, but in very kind of serious manner.
Gorbachev offered Reagan everything he had wanted. They would both destroy half their long-range bombers and missiles, eliminate all the missiles threatening Europe. And he made a major concession on human rights.
And then in the 90s, by the time the Soviet Union had collapsed in 91, and there was the Russian Federation, there was kind of a chummy relationship between Yeltsin of Russia and Clinton.
Coming from my statement yesterday in the United Nations, and if you looked at the press reports, one could see that what you were writing was that today's meeting with President Bill Clinton was going to be a disaster.
Так вот, не первый раз я вам говорю, что вы провалились.
Well, now for the first time I can tell you that you're a disaster.
Be sure you get the right attribution there.
But then in the noughties, a couple of things happened. So one is that first, in the late 90s, another war broke out in Chechnya, and this war became actually the catalyst that led Putin to power, because Putin was going to show that he was stronger than Yeltsin and deal with the Chechens. And he kind of did, leading to this weird kind of power-sharing deal with the Kadyrov rebels. But anyway, Putin came into power, and Putin was kind of a more classic Cold Warrior. And in the US, it was now the neocons under George W. Bush in power. And so a renewed hostility between America and Russia entered into the picture again. And what the West started doing was supporting a number of revolutions that made nations that had previously been in the orbit of Russia and then in the Commonwealth of Independent States became more orientated towards the West. So there was the revolution in Georgia, and there was the revolutions in Ukraine. And in the Russian perception, the West had kind of not lived up to the previous deals and was starting to meddle in its near abroad. And they had to do something.
Vladimir Putin is a man who drops diplomatic bombshells in Russian. His first in CNN's exclusive interview was to accuse the United States not just of fighting Russian troops in Georgia, but of orchestrating the entire conflict for political gain.
We have serious reasons to believe that directly in the combat zone, citizens of the United States were present. And if this is the case, then the suspicion arises that someone in the United States has on purpose created this conflict.
And one of the things that they did was to maintain military presence by any means necessary, basically. So the idea that states that were going to orient themselves towards the West could just sort of politely get the Russians to leave, or they would just kind of, the presence would kind of recede magically, was really shown to be false. For example, in Moldova, on the eastern shore of the Dniester River, there's now this weird kind of gangster state that's just there because there used to be a lot of Russian or Soviet military presence on that part of Moldova. So that's now the supposed country of Transnistria. In the Black Sea, on the Crimean Peninsula, there's the Russian Black Sea Fleet. So then that's why Crimea has been annexed. In eastern Ukraine, there's a larger Russia or Russian-friendly population, so that's why there's the war in the Donbass there. And kind of similar in the Georgian areas of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which are basically occupied by Russia. Now for Armenia, it's a little bit different because by the end of the Nagorno-Karabakh war, situation had already come into existence where the Armenians were very dependent on Russia for their defenses, and all along the borders there's Russians there. And so the notion that Armenia would somehow move away from the Russian orbit was less probable anyway. And even now with the Armenian Revolution 2 years ago, 2018, the new government after the Velvet Revolution was also not going to just move towards the West in the way that Georgia has done, but attempted to pursue a kind of third way approach where they would continue to be friendly with Russia because, well, they need them. And maybe the standoffish posture of Russia right now is also a kind of a cheap way of showing the Armenians that indeed they do need the Russians. Now, another thing that Russia could also do is use its energy reserves and basically keep its hand on the spigot of pipelines running towards Europe, or also building new ones in collaboration with Europe, and maintain control in that way, basically by being able to turn off the heat at inopportune times. And that also had an effect in the Caucasus, because there are very rich deposits around the Caspian, and including around Baku in Azerbaijan. And this has made Azerbaijan very rich in the last 25 years, or comparatively rich anyhow, and also led to the development of pipelines that would bypass Putin's Russia. So there's now pipelines going from Baku through Georgia and then to Turkey, which is another factor in the current conflict. Because Azerbaijan is richer, so it can buy more weapons. But on the other hand, those pipelines are kind of a liability in this war as well.
Fighting continues in the worst regional dispute since a 1994 ceasefire. A long simmering conflict that could escalate into a wider one, with Azerbaijan accusing Armenia of attacking its pipelines, and Armenia accusing Azerbaijan of trying to seize control of the territory. Meanwhile, the wounded keep coming into local hospitals seeking medical help.
And another orbit that's really been changing is that of Turkey. So Turkey is still a member of NATO, but the political changes in Turkey and the actions it has been taking in Syria and in Libya and in the Eastern Mediterranean make it so that notions of Turkey ever joining the European Union have gone out of the window.
Turkey's integration with the EU has been a complicated story. Is it likely to ever join the Union? Euronews talks to German Liberal MEP Alexander Graf Lambsdorff.
In law, Turkey still is a candidate. In fact, it is not. Nobody believes in Brussels, or in Ankara for that matter, that Turkey will eventually join the European Union. And that is why we say it is better to make a new start and put the relationship on a new foundation.
And internally also, Turkey is no longer something like the Kemalist Republic. It is now ruled on the one hand by the AK Party, which is kind of Islamist, but in a more recent development, in kind of a collaboration with the nationalists. So now Erdogan has really adopted a neo-Ottoman kind of stance.
Erdogan's blend of Islam and nationalism is embraced by half of the population. For them, it's the path back to old glories and pre-Ataturk Ottoman times.
Which is, of course, terrifying for Armenians. And so Turkey has been basically not just very supportive of Azerbaijan, but more or less instigating the conflict, it seems. The Azeri armed forces and the Turkish had held maneuvers together earlier this summer, and after those there were still Turkish F-16s in Azerbaijan. Before the war started, there's at least very strong indications that Turkey basically shipped Syrian jihadist fighters from the civil war into Azerbaijan to fight on behalf of the Azeri government against the Armenians.
We definitely can confirm it, not because we have evidences, but sometimes if you don't have evidence, you have indications. Turkey used those terrorists coming from different countries in Syria. They used the same method in Libya. They used Syrian terrorists in Libya, maybe with other nationalities. So it's self-evident and very much probable that they are using that in Nagorno-Karabakh. Because, as I said earlier, they are the one who started this problem, this conflict. They encouraged this conflict. So they wanted to achieve something, and they're going to use the same method.
And they see an opening, apparently. It looks like Russia is occupied elsewhere and occupying elsewhere. America is busy with itself, with elections and Corona and Trump.
Armenia, you know Armenia? We're working on that. You know, we're working. We did it with Kosovo and Serbia. Do you believe I got 3 nominations for the Nobel Peace Prize? Can you believe it? Can you believe it?
And so Turkey can try to project its power elsewhere, including against Armenians, who are very unpopular in Turkey. There is real Armenophobia, and Armenian journalists have been murdered in the street for talking about the genocide.
The murder of Hrant Dink, one of Turkey's best-known journalists who spoke out against the mass killing of Armenians a century ago, has been condemned in Turkey itself and around the world. President Chirac of France called it an abominable act, depriving Turkey, he said, of one of its most courageous voices. Hrant Dink was shot in broad daylight in Istanbul.
And so that situation is completely different compared to also the first war, the war of the 90s, let's say, and the position that Turkey was in back then. And the final piece in this very terrible puzzle is Europe. So with Britain leaving the European Union, now Europe is less Atlanticist, right? Britain was always kind of the bridge between America and the EU, and now the strongest military power within the EU by far is France, also the only nuclear power. And because Germany is the rich one, France wants to see itself as at least the strong one, which is why Macron is making these noises also in the Eastern Mediterranean against Turkish influence peddling there.
Look, as Turkey and Turkish government, we have no problem with French people. And we cannot. We are allies, and we have been actually like-minded countries in many areas, including Syria. But we are against your President Macron's statements, also very hostile attitudes against us.
And also in defense of Armenia, of course, France also has a fairly large number of Armenians in the diaspora.
Et je veux aussi être très clair, nous disposons d'informations aujourd'hui, de manière certaine, qui indiquent que des combattants syriens ont quitté le théâtre d'opération, des combattants de groupes djihadistes, en transitant par Gaziantep pour rejoindre ce théâtre d'opération du Haut-Karabakh.
And the trauma for Europe, of course, is that these kind of wars are also kind of reminiscent of the wars in former Yugoslavia during the 90s.
A negotiating team from the European community arrives tonight to help monitor a ceasefire which many are counting on, but almost no one is betting on. Mike Lee, ABC News, Zagreb, Yugoslavia.
And there, the idea at first was that this was going to be the moment for Europe to handle its own affairs and end the wars there, but couldn't. And in the end, Clinton had to come in and start bombing. And of course now, even that is not really an option on the table. So now what is Europe going to do except make noises? So this is really a terrible moment. So what happens next? If this is a win for Azerbaijan and therefore for Turkey, it would be a tragedy for the Armenian people that live there. And there would only be a very small Armenian strip of the country proper that separates Turkey and Azerbaijan and links Turkey directly to the Caspian. Turkish efforts to establish its influence there are already underway. Today there was an announcement that the military links between Turkey and Kazakhstan are being strengthened. Turkey and Turkmenistan also get along quite well. There's a wrestling match going on between Turkey and Russia. And the current conflict is only a part of that.
I can say you that it's not religion war. Always have a new nuance. It's a more and more geopolitical war. It's not only war about or for Karabakh. It's a war. It's a competition now between Turkey and Russia. Who will rule in South Caucasus and in Caucasus?
This fragment is from an Armenian priest sitting in a bombed-out church, actually analyzing what he thinks is going on right now. And I think he's right. And then the question is, what are the next neo-Ottoman ambitions? Not too long ago, Putin had a public appearance where it's kind of meet the press type thing, where he was asked, well, if these are Turkey's designs, then what about Crimea? Because that was once Ottoman as well. Of course, Putin answered that there was nothing to worry about and Russia is very strongly in control, which is probably true, but the fact that it's asked is very telling. Right now, Russia maintains a hold on the north side of the Caucasus, partly by ruling through proxies. There was this story in the news about concentration camps for gay people in Russia. And that's geographically within Russia, but that's actually inside Chechnya, which is ruled by a warlord who has formed these camps because of his religious Islamic objections to homosexuality. So this is not actually Russian policy. The strongman of Chechnya, Kadyrov, kind of has been given a free hand by Putin as long as he stays on Moscow's side. And that's not necessarily a given.
It's all about this man, Akhmat Kadyrov, the first president of Chechnya and father of today's Chechnyan leader, Ramzan Kadyrov. In the 1990s, Russia waged a bloody war against Chechnya, one of its own federal republics. At that time, Kadyrov was an Islamic leader calling for holy war against the Russians. Later, he changed sides. But he didn't tone down his extremist views. It's said you once claimed if every Chechen killed 150 Russians, he would make it to paradise.
No. In the mid-90s, I told the Chechens to kill as many Russians as possible. I didn't say how many, just as many as they could. It's no secret that I called for jihad.
During the Chechen wars and the wars in Dagestan, rebels were supported by Turkey. And who knows if Turkey might be interested in starting to support them again.
What a display of dominance by Habib Nurmagomedov. He is a monster. I look at that, I'm like, please tap. Just please tap. You're not going to get out of that. Incredible. Incredible performance by Nurmagomedov.
This week, the UFC fighter Khabib Nurmagomedov announced his retirement. He's apparently a monster, says Joe Rogan. But he's also kind of a pawn in this match that's going on. After one of his recent wins, he was invited to Moscow, and there Putin received him and very deferentially said that, of course, he too, Khabib, a Muslim from Dagestan, is of course also part of the Russian family, and we are all very concerned and interested in how you do, and very proud. And there was a little coffee table with a tray with some snacks. And another time he was received in Istanbul very festively with a big dinner party, and he's met Erdogan. It was all smiles and fun for everybody. And clearly he is a plaything in the charm offensive here, which is a kind of offensive that Turkey is playing everywhere, also in the Balkans, for example. There's a lot of Turkish investment and development in the Balkans, including in countries like Serbia, for example, and of course also Albania and North Macedonia and so on. So this isn't over yet with this particular conflict. And Russia is actually seemingly weaker in its own backyard than we in the West think. And Turkey has a lot of big plans, which is terrible news for the Armenians. So with that, thank you very much for listening, and all the best. And let's hope the next ceasefire holds.
I should like to see any power of the world destroy this race, this small tribe of unimportant people whose history is ended, whose wars have all been fought and lost, whose structures have crumbled, whose literature is unread, whose music is unheard, whose prayers are no longer uttered. Go ahead, destroy this race. Let us say that it is again 1915, there is war in the world. Destroy Armenia. See if you can do it. Send them from their homes into the desert. Let them have neither bread nor water. Burn their houses and their churches. See if they will not live again. See if they will not laugh again. See if the race will not live again when two of them meet in a beer parlor 20 years later and laugh and speak in their tongue. Go ahead. See if you can do anything about it. See if you can stop them from mocking the big ideas of the world. You sons of bitches. A couple of Armenians talking in the world. Go ahead. Try to destroy them.